Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this, our final session of the Insight 2021 Festival, hosted by the Midlands Decision Support Network. The session is Insight to Action, Lessons from the Think Tanks. My name's Simon Bourne. I'm Programme Director for the Midlands Decision Support Network, and I'm your host for today. We've had an absolutely fantastic festival to date, and you can find all of the sessions on our website, which will be posted in the chat box. Before we kick off, same story as usual. If you can have your mics muted, cameras off unless you're on the panel. Feel free to ask questions or post some comments in the chat as we go along. Depending on time, we might be able to draw on some of these. For a starting point, it would be great if those attending could introduce themselves in the chat box so we get a sense of who's joining us in the room to listen to our speakers today. And if you'd like to tweet us as we go along, use the hashtag Insight2021. So our topic of discussion today is Insight to Action. Now, the Midlands Decision Support Network exists to support health and care leaders across the region, generate insights from high quality analysis, and then move those into action in the form of better evidence-informed decisions in integrated care systems. But moving insight to action is challenging. How do we ensure that the insights we generate get converted to meaningful change? What needs to be in place in health and care systems in terms of capacity, capability, culture? So think tanks, specialist analytical teams and researchers all play a really key role in the health and social care landscape in this country. And arguably their entire purpose is to see insight turned into action, though without a direct hand on the levers of power. So what have they learned from all of their accumulated experience? With me today to discuss this is an absolutely wonderful panel. We've got Jennifer Dixon, Chief Executive of the Health Foundation, Nigel Edwards, Chief Executive of the Nuffield Trust, Richard Murray, Chief Executive of the King's Fund, Professor John Glasby, Director of the recently founded Impact Centre for Translating Social Care Insights into Practice, and Peter Spilsbury, Director of the Strategy Unit. So I'd like to start by asking each of you in turn just to share some opening reflections on the topic of moving insight into action. And Jennifer, I wonder if we could start with you, please.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Peter, for inviting me, and hello, everybody. I hope you've had a good festival, and actually look forward to hearing your insights about this question. So just a few comments from me, I think. The first thing, I think there's probably 6 things I quickly want to say here about how you get action from insight. I think the first thing is to start in the pathway further back from the actual analysis that you've done. It's really in the conception, the conception of the topic which you are looking at and which you work on. I think it's got to be hot. Someone's got to want it. Ideally, in your world, I think it would be an actionable question. Although in our world, we also do work that really dissects and punctures groupthink, so there's not necessarily a direct action. So I think the first thing is start in the decision about which topic to look at, make sure someone wants it and it's a hot one. The second thing is the way analysis is done. I think it's very important to engage actors along the way, make sure that they understand what's going on, they can give insights, the right people are engaged. It's not done over in a corner by analysts in a basement somewhere, and indeed the results then aren't sort of suddenly revealed in shock and awe, but they are socialized along the way. So I think that really does help to modify the analysis and help people own it. I think the third thing is then the follow through, and I think there's a really big issue. It's a big obvious issue in how the results are communicated. Make sure they're clear, they're socialized, the case is argued for. This often means good communications, particularly in the analyst world. It's very important to write. Make sure you know who your target audience, what presses their buttons, the timing of it. Use partners to socialize the results as well. Sometimes you need a bit of a campaign. So I think that's very important. Then also to make sure that whatever the results include have some kind of good recommendations that you've socialized, so that you've drawn them up with others. They're not just high level vague, but they're specific. and that you can provide some kind of good solutions and possibly support to help or locate support what might be a complex set of actions as a result. And ideally, it depends how much money you've got. In places like the foundation, we've got funds that then we can give grant development work to help people socialise, to adapt and adopt solutions that follow from the analysis. And then I think the sixth thing is just to keep up pressure. If you land your analysis and no one's taking any notice, then it's time to get a bit more, to push it further, try hard, sometimes even get a bit antsy. There are tools and techniques which the dark arts we can talk about later. But I would say those six things are the kind of essence really of what I would say. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's really useful. I wonder, Nigel, if we could hear from you next.
Yes, well, I'll build on that rather than repeat it, although I do think this point about making sure that you've got a client for your ideas, or at least a receptive context is really important. And one of the things that you might want to do is sort of improve the skills on the client side. One of the problems in the NHS often is that we've got experts producing material for people who don't quite know what they want and don't know what good looks like. So a bit of educating the client is good. Where it then goes wrong, excuse me. So one thing we often see is that we haven't spent enough time on defining the problem. So we're already in difficulty. By the time we've had our insight, we may have found that we're based our ideas on well-known facts that aren't true, intuitions, groupthink, or perhaps a too narrow specification of the problem. The next thing we observe a lot, particularly in quite a lot of the work that's been going on around integrated care and population health management, are logic models and theories of change which are incomplete or actually have got dubious causal links within them based on a bit of individual theorizing, attribution errors, and almost certainly a certain level of optimism bias, and often also a neglect of context, particularly where models are being copied from one place to another. So your insight is not context free. And I think you really need to be thinking about how the insights that we take are going to be then applied in different settings and in places with different starting points. I think a couple of other areas where we're quite weak sometimes is not really thinking through the sort of system dynamics that flow from the insights that we've got, or the service delivery model designs that we're putting in place, or the decisions that might flow from the analysis. So a classic problem is supply-induced demand from the development of services that we think are a solution for one problem, and in fact actually just generate additional demand for services within the area we're already working in. There's sort of displacement and duplication problems, and problems about dead weight, in other words, doing things that would have happened anyway, because we haven't fully understood how what we're looking at fits into the wider context. So really thinking in terms of the system dynamics seems really important, and it's where many of our ideas run into problems. Another area where there's a degree of skepticism, particularly if you're talking to the Treasury or indeed actually perhaps within the NHS, about the way that benefits are claimed. A classic problem is mistaking price for cost. So we say, oh well, we'll prevent 1,000 admissions and every admission is £1,500, and therefore if I multiply one by the other I get the saving. But actually, of course, in the real world in which we're working, the benefits there are significantly different from the price saving, because most of the costs are sunk. So getting alongside our analysis needs to be probably a more sophisticated understanding of the dynamics of how money really moves around the system, what's actually cashable, and the real final problem that we have, of course, is implementation. And I think a really interesting question that I think we should probably do some more research on is how far is the last mile really important? In other words, is there a non-linear return to implementation? If I do 95% of what the analysis or the model or whatever it is I'm trying to do, if I do 95% of that, what do I get? I suspect in many cases we get 30% of the result. So I think understanding what are the components of success here, as we're thinking about redesign and thinking about the problem, and then I think that the final problem, not entirely relevant to the topic here, but just something to always be keeping in mind is how far is regression to the mean likely to be operating. It's the enemy of many of our best ideas, and really taking a critical view of that. So think about the problem, ensure you've got the right logic, understand the system dynamics, have a better understanding of the context, calculate your benefits in ways that are realistic and matter to people, and focus on this last mile.
Wonderful, thank you, Nigel. Really useful reflections. Richard, could I get your opening thoughts, please?
Yeah, thank you. So I am Chief Executive of the King's Fund, so like Jennifer and Nigel, trying slightly to influence from the outside, but I was also Chief Economist and Chief Analyst in the Department of Health, and actually in NHS England for a while. So I'm going to bring in a little bit of both elements of insight, and hi to people that used to work with me. I've already seen Nalini on the line, as was once on the other side of the fence. I'll start by saying something that's almost blindingly obvious, is make sure you're right. So there's a lot around the QA that sometimes gets underplayed. Sometimes through that, you can get away with it, you can be wrong, but no one will ever work it out because the model is so complicated. But when it becomes visibly that you were wrong, can be incredibly damaging and take a long time to get back the trust of the people that you're working with. And you might want to take a look at the Macpherson review back in 2013 with a major error in a model that went all the way up to number 10. And it wasn't problem definition. It wasn't misunderstanding the benefits. It was one line in a spreadsheet, picked up the wrong line in another spreadsheet, multiplied them together, and it wasn't right. And it was one of those ones where you thought, that couldn't have ever been right, could it? The answer was always odd, but no one checked it and worked out what the case was. I think in general, if it looks odd, start kicking the wheels just to make sure you've got this absolutely right. Recovering your reputation is a tricky thing once you've lost it. And then broadly, and it slightly wraps up some things I think that Nigel and Jennifer spoke about as well, is know your client. Now, I don't know whether you're going to call the ICSs your customer or your client, but one of the issues both for us now as a think tank, but also when I was in the department, is exactly how close and how do you understand the challenges that the people you're trying to influence face? Do you sit with them? Are you part of their team? Are you a separate team that gets commissioned? Do you effectively throw analysis over the fence because you found something clever? What's the nature of that engagement? And think about it very closely. The closer you get, the more that you understand their challenges, the more relevant that you'll be. You do run risks of how you generate complex models. If you're part of another team, you can become sometimes overly short term, trying to help firefight. And so there's a continual tension as to how close you get, so you really understand. You can also retain some independence and make sure the rigor of your models and the rigor of your analysis really works. To pick up one of the, I think both Nigel and Jennifer have said, really think about the presentation and the language. Most of the people you'll be trying to influence do not have an analytical background. Check for the jargon. When we do work now in the fund, and I wish I'd known this when I was back in the department, there'll be various versions of the work, and one of them will basically be a paragraph. What is it that a busy leader would want to take away from this work? And if you haven't actually found anything, don't bother telling them. Don't waste people's time. It needs to be a value add. It needs to be something that people want to open, want to look at. And sometimes negative results, they're very important to find. You need to know if it didn't work, but don't rattle people's cages unless you've really got something for them that they really need to look at. If you have, by the way, embedded people very close to the client, they can act as that conduit. Sometimes that could be a very powerful model of leveraging someone that is very close, kind of lives and breathes the issues that the people you're trying to influence are facing, but then there's a hinterland behind them that can bring in some of the heavy lifting. The other thing I'd say is really think closely about what does action orientated mean? What action are you looking for? And it links to what Nigel was saying about implementation. And I'm now partly kind of channeling what it's like to be a policy lead or to be the decision maker. Problems without solutions are a very, very mixed benefit. If you don't think you can do anything about it, if there isn't a decision, isn't an action that you can take, that can actually lead to any real difference. And so to think very closely, if you found an issue, found a problem, what is it you think people should do, and spend probably even more time on that, because often it's the delivery issue, which is the trickiest one. And at the moment, at least, and sometimes this just varies through time, always think about workforce. Never, I mean, the cost's fantastic. Speak to a lot of people in the NHS at the moment. They've got a lot of money in the bank account. There's no staff to spend it on. So their actions are incredibly constrained by the resources that they've got in front of them. And often that is workforce at the moment. And I'll stop there, Simon.
Thank you, Richard. John, if I could move over to you now, what do you think? Any initial thoughts here? John, can you hear me there? I'll tell you what, I'll come back to you in just a moment. Peter, why don't we head over to you next? Given what you've heard so far, any additional thoughts to build upon what we've heard?
To me, Simon?
Yes.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Hi. Yeah, well, I've got 6 things as well, copying Jennifer. I think the first is just to think about what insight is. It can sound a bit arrogant, can't it? We've suddenly generated insight. But I think the idea of insight is it's an illuminating understanding of how complex things work. And the chances that someone can produce that kind of understanding in isolation are low. So I think the first thing is always start when some analysis has thrown up an interesting finding. What does this mean for us here? How do we understand this in our local context? And I think that points towards a lot more co-production around insight and the use of deliberative types of processes. And if people didn't see it, I would point you at the session we had with Sir Michael Marmot and Julian Huppert, Swaran Singh, Kelly Beaver, when there was quite a lot of discussion about that film from one of our earlier sessions. Second thing I'd say in terms of analytical contributions to insight, analysis is only useful if it leads to a decision to do something. So getting the decision-making processes right seems key to me. We need the demand side and the supply side around this. We need an appetite. We need leaders who want to use analysis to inform decision. We need methods. We need understanding about how certain analytical concepts work and so on. And within the Midlands Decision Support Network, we're actually starting a learning program around decision quality, critical thinking, analytical methods for leaders. All those things I think are very important. That's the third point. Catching attention is hard. We live in a world where the volume of insight that is being offered is so huge. We don't these days have the people we used to have. When I joined the health service, whose job it was to read stuff, understand it, become subject matter experts. A lot of that's gone. So working out how we get beyond describing into inciting passion and making useful recommendations is really important. And in my book, that requires really high quality context specific knowledge. It's much more difficult to produce that kind of quality of insight as an outsider dipping in. And if people want to see something interesting around how to generate that kind of passion and a different kind of insight, the session with Dr. Catherine Mannix, Justin Wiltshire and Ollie Minton called Data for the Head, Stories for the Heart. I really recommend watching that film. It was brilliant. Next, it has to be good quality. Picking up Richard's point, I mean, how often do we see in the NHS people claiming success for things which, as Nigel mentioned, were actually regression to the mean? But the key thing we need to get much better at is talking about contextual information. Not just did it work, but how did it work? In what circumstances? What does that tell us? And we need to get much better at using a much broader set of data to inform that. What do citizens think? What do the front line think? What do service users think? And start bringing all of that in. Next, when it comes to analysis, one of my tips is generic insight will rarely be suitable for a specific question. beware those who will sell you tools and dashboards. Look instead, perhaps for inspiration, to visionary approaches like the Born in Bradford longitudinal study that Professor John Wright was talking about in his session earlier in the Insight Festival. And then my last one is, I think we could do much better at how we deal with uncertainty. The NHS loves plans where we put single point numbers in for what's going to happen in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, and it's nonsense, isn't it? And people get frustrated by uncertainty, but actually I think we could turn it on its head and start to use uncertainty in a much more positive way, and start to think through the insight work we do about how we can understand uncertainty as a way to understand the extent of flexibility we need to be building into our thinking about the future. And I think if we don't do that well, we actually cheese off a lot of people in the NHS, most of our clinical workforce who've been brought up in the scientific method. So those would be my observations.
Thank you, Peter. I'll come back to you now, John. You should be able to unmute now. Could I get your initial thoughts on the topic?
Yeah, thank you very much. And for colleagues who don't know, I'm in the process of setting up a new UK Centre for Implementing Evidence in Adult Social Care called IMPACT, which stands for Improving Adult Care Together. It's been co-funded by the SRC and the Health Foundation. So thank you very much indeed to Jennifer for enabling us to do this work. It's such an amazing opportunity for the sector. And in our design phase, we've been running a series of assemblies across the 4 nations with users, carers, practitioners, managers, providers, commissioners and researchers. We've had an online survey with about 2,000 responses from across the sector and done probably about 100 stakeholder meetings with quite senior social care colleagues across the 4 nations as we design our work and think how to take it forward. And the messages have been really clear, actually, about what helps. First of all, people have been clear that there's a series of practical and cultural barriers to using evidence in adult social care. I trained as a social worker, and when I was a student, someone who went on to be very senior in social care actually said to me, "You'll make a good social worker, John. The trouble is you think too much." Now, I know what they meant. I was probably, you've got to learn to walk before you can run. You can't ask too many questions. You probably have to earn the right to ask questions. I'm sure I was a very irritating student. But you think too much is a really interesting way to frame it with something as important as social care that touches people's lives in such fundamental, intimate ways. How could you ever possibly think too much about it? And I also wonder if it's something we would have said to somebody in a different sector, for example, to a surgeon about to go into a very complex operation. Is it possible to think too much in that situation? So there's a series of practical and cultural challenges to overcome. People have then said what they're really missing is practical support in the realities of local services to get stuff implemented into practice. We have policy telling us what we ought to be doing. We have evidence and data giving us some indications about what might work. But the hard bit is, yes, but how do you actually do that in practice? And how do you do it for real? And where I'm based, how do you do it in the wrong part of Birmingham on a Friday afternoon when it's raining? That level of detail. And many colleagues feeling that a lot of the support and assistance that we had historically probably was lost for practical implementation during austerity, as we had to focus on frontline service delivery, and many of the background supports that helped us with implementation have been lost, and IMPACT is hoping to provide a lot of that practical support. People have then said that social care in particular needs to value different types of knowledge. We're an evidence centre, and our definition will include different types of research, but it will also include the lived experience of people who draw on care and support and carers, and it will include the practice knowledge of adult social care staff. And we'd see each of those ways of knowing the world, research, lived experience and practice knowledge, as important in their own right. And maybe you need to bring them together to triangulate and to work with them as you try and bring people together from different backgrounds to work on common challenges and common solutions. Next, people have just talked about the pressures that they're under. just the time and the space that is needed to engage, the kind of thinking time and the working together. So some of what Impact will do in its convening role will be around participation costs and convening, particularly for people who draw on care and support, carers and frontline care workers who may often be in roles where they can't be freed up from the here and now to come to events or to meet other people. So the practicalities of participating and coming together and sharing voices seems key. And then finally, people have said that adult social care in particular feels like a very fragmented system with different stakeholders who have different ideas and different ways of working, but who rarely come into contact with each other, and a real lack of shared spaces to come together to share those different perspectives and to work on hopefully common ways forward. So that's a kind of perspective from social care, maybe different in healthcare, although I suspect that some of the issues may be similar. And it derives very much from that direct engagement around, if we're setting up an evidence centre, how should we best do it? What could it, how could it add most value, and so on? And some really tangible advice that we've had back from the field. And just going back to where I started, if we were successful as a centre, I'd hope in a few years' time, if a social work student, irritating or not, said to their manager, why do we do it like that? Rather than getting closed down, so you think too much, the manager might say, well, we do it like that because there's really good evidence based on research, based on what we know from practice, and based on the realities of people's lives that this really works, and that's why we do it. And that to me is kind of what's at stake in terms of overcoming some of those practical and cultural barriers to moving insight into action.
Brilliant. Thank you, John. So you've all had an opportunity to share some initial reflections. I wonder if I could invite you just to respond to one another's points. If there's anything that piqued your interest when you were listening to one another speaking. Jennifer, go ahead.
I think this last point that John made is a really, really good one. It's an obvious point, isn't it? Which is about how to create the space, permission, trust, cover, structure, culture in an organisation to allow experimentation. And actually, because if you think about it, a lot of the evidence that we produce is inevitably partial. A lot of people probably on this call will be quantitative analysts. We know the limitations of data. So we're going to have to sort of leaven that with qualitative real world experience to modify and course correct if we want to implement anything of value. But to do all that, you need some kind of permission space within the organisation, and difficult in this very stretched times, isn't it? Some of the work that we've done on which organisations do adopt and spread faster and indeed are higher quality do have some kind of recognised system and culture. Actually, if you look at all the CQC hospitals, for example, that are the highest performing, they do have some kind of structure. It doesn't have to be quality improvement itself, but it could be some kind of recognised system that they're using, which does help them. It's not the only answer, but it's the context in which people are trying to implement change is incredibly important. And unless we tackle some of this with leadership and management, we're not going to get very far. So I know Richard and Nigel will have a lot to say about it, and Peter. Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer. Richard, over to you.
I'm just struck from we've all been speaking about the complexity of getting the problem right, the complexity of the analysis of landing the message. You think, oh my God, you end up thinking I'm in the wrong career. Should have picked a bit easier. What that leads me back to is the analysis is as good and as useful as the staff that you've got to do it. And one thing I think to focus on, but particularly in a as new structures form, is what's the career development, what's the staff support you're giving to yourselves, because as I say, you are, and your advice will be as good as the people that you've got, as the people that are on this call now. So even as you are thinking about how to be helpful, do keep that CPD, keep that required skill set in mind, and then put the support in place to yourself to make sure that you've got it, because that's the foundation on which everything else is built.
you, Richard. Peter, did you want to respond to that or build on it?
I mean, there were two things going through my mind as we were talking. Well, more than two, but I'll mention two. The first was how important I think it is to shortcut the route by which, in particular, I'll use clinicians generically, but frontline people who've got a real desire to improve services, shortcut the route that they have to follow to get access to good quality analytical support. I do think I've just seen so many examples in recent years of clinicians who have fired up, have got some really good ideas about how they want to do things, but they've just got no direct handle on levers to be able to get the support to do it. And by the time they've fought their way through all the intermediaries, that the idea dies. So in whatever we do, try and find a way to do that. The second thing about space interests me. I think we've got such a culture of heroic leadership in the NHS, and of course at times that's great. But I do think we waste a lot of time on repeated efforts of doing things badly because someone at the beginning on high says this has got to be done in a month. And when you come back 6 months later and it hasn't been done, or 3 attempts have been done at it to do it badly, it's quite frustrating when if at the start someone had said, no, but actually if we spent 4 months on it, we'd be able to do a really good job. And actually, if they'd gone down that path, they'd have had it 2 months earlier.
Thanks, Peter. John, did you want to come in there?
Yes, it's very linked to what colleagues have said, but we've also seen situations where people use a commitment to evidence-based practice as a reason for not doing things. So show me the evidence that this will work before I do it. And then they have a particular definition of what constitutes valid evidence, and we never kind of meet that threshold. And we subject the new idea to a higher evidence threshold than we do stuff that we do day to day, a lot of which has no evidence behind it, and yet we do it anyway. And so rather than evidence-based practice, sometimes we talk to those organisations about practice-based evidence. You know, if we haven't got an evidence about what would work, we've got quite a lot of evidence of what doesn't work. So why don't we stop doing some of the stuff that doesn't work, then try and do something better, and then learn by doing and reflecting and evaluating as we go. So a form of practice-based evidence rather than evidence-based practice, because certainly based in academia, we see loads of situations where someone says there's a real problem, can you help us with the evidence? And then colleagues will say, yes, give us 3 years and £500,000 and we'll come back with an answer. And actually we need to do something about it next week. So if we need to do something about it next week, irrespective of what evidence we had, what would be best to do if we had a series of things to do, and what should be some of the things that we don't do? Just kind of that connecting to the real world so that we get the balance right, with evidence as something that we generate as we go sometimes, rather than something that we have to have before we even start out.
Thank you, John. Nigel, your thoughts?
Yes, I think that developing evidence as you go point is a very good one. And also, I mean, not only is the evidence threshold for new things higher than it is for old things, so is the cost. So is the cost thing. It's a kind of interesting example of what Daniel Kahneman calls the endowment effect, which is you value what you've got at probably at a disproportionately high rate compared with. So giving things up is really hard. We've talked a lot about, and one of the interesting things I think, and you see it in the Secretary of State's current outburst on management, an overprivileging of leadership. And actually, you know, I think one of the key things that the key clients for analysis and the sort of insights that can be produced are not just the top leaders. So there's a whole bunch of people. Don't want to use the term middle, because it's really it's not very helpful, but you kind of know who I mean. So there's a whole bunch of other people who are potentially extremely important clients for this type of insight, and are a bit hung up on producing data describing what has happened as opposed to understanding it, and also what could happen if things were different. So I think back to this idea of sort of cultivating an intelligent client for the work that's done is working with a wider cross-section of leaders and clinicians, particularly sort of people in clinical leadership positions, potentially great allies and great users of this type of work. And in particular, for those types of examples that John was talking about there, where you actually say, well, let's generate we don't know, so let's generate the evidence by small scale trials, which, by the way, aren't research. So don't take 6 months of ethics audit or improvement.
Thank you, Nigel. Peter, your hand's raised. You're muted at the moment.
I'm sorry, Simon. Sorry, I'm still kind of slightly obsessing on this thing about timelines. One of the things that I think is quite interesting for the NHS as a huge national enterprise with kind of almost unrivaled amounts of data, how strange it is we don't have a rolling programme of national analysis addressing the enduring questions. So I agree, we do have situations where everyone's saying, look, we need something urgently, but quite often it's surprising it's needed urgently. So I do remember a time not that long ago when people were racing around trying to do pieces of work in about a week to try to see whether they could understand anything about the interrelationship between levels of social care funding and NHS activity. Well, that's hardly like a novel question, isn't it? And how remarkable it was, really, that there weren't a group of people who were working on that question all along, and who therefore had a lot more of the contextual understanding that would allow them to address some of the short run questions. So one of the things we want to try and do through the Midlands network, and I'd love to see this taken wider really, would be to get a greater sense of what those enduring problems are and start to build up a really high quality programme of analytical insight that's ready and waiting when the urgent question comes along.
Thank you, Peter. Richard, can I bring you in there?
I mean, just to pick up what you just said, Peter, I mean, you're absolutely right. And that was a challenge over many years back in the department, is by the time you were asked the question, it was too late to do anything about it, but surely it was possible to have worked out the question was going to come. You did need a bit of headroom to do it. The social care one, I think, has been investigated once or twice. I just don't think it ever gave quite the answer that everybody wanted. But one other, by the way, just a log, is what do you actually do about inequalities once you've realised that they're there? They've been there for a long time, and there's a big evidence base about what you can do. But again, you end up trying to develop new evidence too quickly. I just wanted to clock, I think, for people who are beginning to work with ICSs, you know, it's great having longer term research projects that you can really bring to bear doing complex modelling, but a lot of people we're probably going to end up doing performance monitoring and responding to the latest unreasonable requests on timing for a new set of plans that need to be done by the end of the year, and then why don't they work? Because that does eat up a lot of headroom. I think you know, to give credit to local leaders, they know it's not going to work. I mean, they have to do it, but they know there's no possibility whatsoever that these plans written in enormous haste, supposed to deliver breathtaking gains in productivity and clear ways, are ever going to happen. And I think for analysts to work alongside those leaders, to understand the constraints that they're under, to give them respect for the things that they have, I mean, they just have to do them and they have to engage in this. And then to try and find that space where you really do have some discretion, either at local, regional level, to actually make a difference. But once or twice, I think, you know, from my career, where an analyst might say, why are you doing that? It's obviously wrong. The response from it'll be, yeah, I do know that. I'm not stupid. I just don't have any choice. I have to do it. And again, it's one of those bits about being close enough to the people that you work with to understand what room for manoeuvre they've got and how you can help them in a real practical way.
Thank you, Richard. Jennifer, can I invite you in there?
Yeah, I just want to go back to the previous point, which is the very important point Peter made, which is that there are some basic enduring questions that actually everybody needs some common knowledge about, which often get neglected, whether it's funding projections, resource needs, workforce planning, indeed inequalities. They may not actually have an actionable answer right now, but they are definitely part of the context that one needs to know, therefore space. So just a small example. So, you know, at the foundation, I noticed Charles Tallock's on the line watching, but you know, we felt we had to set up the real centre to do long-term funding projections with demand and supply models. Which are, you know, you'd think that they would exist, but they don't. So that's what Anita and co have been doing. And similarly, we had to fund the MOM at 10 years on. You know, in a sense, why does a foundation have to do that? You know, why isn't that part of the woodwork, that actually there is a state of the nation assessment every 2 years, 5 years, whatever, to Parliament to say this is what's happening to the health assets of the nation? So you'd be surprised. So so in all the move to make analysis actionable, which is very laudable, I actually think there is definitely benefit from some key questions that are constantly on the boil, for which there's no obvious immediate answer, and to create space for that, without which the actionable stuff just won't stick because it doesn't have the right kind of context, if you see what I mean.
Peter, go ahead.
I was kind of interested to ask my colleagues on the panel, really, that there is this sort of theme about how recognizing that not everything comes from the leadership. However, if we don't have a leadership that walks the talk in terms of analytically informed decision making, we're going to struggle. And you know, you can produce the best analysis in the world, if there isn't a decision making process or an appetite to receive it or use it, it's not going to have impact. So, and yet, even though I hear leaders in conversation say they appreciate that, I also then get them say things like, but we can only spend an hour on this. And I was kind of interested in colleagues' view, because if you're a leader responsible for spending billions of pounds of pooled money on behalf of the population, how strange is it that you can do that without having to demonstrate that you have some basic understanding of some key analytical concepts? So I'm interested to know what colleagues think about how we might be able to address that equation.
Thanks, Peter. I wonder, Nigel or John, would you like to come in there? Nigel,
if I knew the answer to that question, a whole series of other problems, you know, I'd probably be talking to you from my beachfront home if I'd solve that. I think it is very tricky. I've definitely noticed this. Well, so the problem of the urgent to swamp the important, and to be told this is the most important thing, and then discover that the chief executive doesn't come to any of the project meetings, which makes you wonder how important it is. I don't know if the solution lies in our hands here, Peter. I think this idea of creating a constituency of people who are clients for the analysis and are interested in the problem may help with it. But I'm actually at a bit of a loss, because it's certainly something I've encountered, and I've yet to see it. You know, it does actually require the leaders of the organisation to purposefully decide not to do that. Perhaps Richard's got the answer.
Fantastic. Richard, let's hope so. Richard, go ahead.
Well, as I say, I was at the department as an analyst for a very, very long time. I think if you're caught with very senior leaders trying to explain complicated analysis, you've almost certainly lost, because next to you will be a clinician having a go at trying to explain to them the clinical background for what they're doing, and a special advisor having a go at doing the politics. When it works is if you've understood the things that they're trying to do and what matters, and they trust you. You don't need, I can think about some of the most complicated modelling we did around resource allocation and the resource allocation formula and tariff. It wouldn't be for me to try and explain the complexities of the model, how brilliant that methodology, fantastic, it was really groundbreaking. You would hope that the senior leader knows what they've asked you. you've understood it, and they trust you when you go, I think this works. So I go back to the issue about trust. If you are trapped trying to go through these complexities with senior leaders, I'm not sure you'll ever get there. What I would say is, I've never met a senior leader who wanted to be wrong. Now, ever. They don't like it. Who does want to be wrong? And so there is something about how are you getting alongside them to help them, because every objective, I think, is largely the same. Occasionally you find a few careerists, I'm sure, who aren't that bothered, but generally not, and certainly not in the health service. And so I think I'd be thinking about what kind of engagement you want with people, because they will remain busy. That they are going to stay busy. So I'm not too sure that just asking, can I have 4 hours of your time because it's worth a 4-hour session, I'm not sure that's ever going to get anywhere. But anyway, it's a tough one.
Thanks, Richard. Could I take John's point next, please?
Yeah, there were two things I was going to say there, slightly contradictory actually, but one is I was in a session once with a former colleague of mine who's now at Manchester Business School, Kieran Walsh, where he asked some of our leaders who run leadership development programs in the health service how much they read and what they read in a sort of safe space. And I won't say which group it was or what part of the country, but it was actually quite shocking. Most people read the HSJ a bit. They tended to start with the adverts and then they flicked forward to other articles. And they read some stuff from colleagues on the panel, which is great. But actually beyond that, they didn't read very much at all. And when you did a similar exercise with clinicians around keeping up with sort of research evidence and so on, the differences were quite stark. Now, who knows whether people tell the truth in those kind of, classroom exercises, but just, a layperson in that situation would have been surprised, at Peter's point, that people so senior could have trained 20 years ago and I know that reading is only one way of engaging with new ideas, but it was quite shocking. What I wanted to say was, as part of setting up Impact, we've been engaging with lots of knowledge mobilization organizations and sort of practitioner networks, and they've been really clear that you don't sell evidence to people by extolling its virtues, because they're not really interested in a busy job, and because there's quite a lot of suspicion and division between research and practice. They're quite separate worlds. But that if you can connect to the value base of why people came into a role in the first place, and you can demonstrate how evidence can help people achieve what they're trying to achieve, then you win over skeptics by doing it together, if you like, rather than by trying to sell it to them. So if one of our projects that we run further down the line as Impact is, just hypothetically, how do you help more people with learning disabilities and autism come out of long stay hospitals and lead more ordinary lives in the community? If I went in and said, I've got a great peer-reviewed article that would really help you with that, I'm surprised you're not doing it like this already, and gave it to somebody, I'd probably get fairly short shrift in the middle of a pandemic. If we said, actually, you came into the job to help people with learning disabilities come out of long stay hospitals and to lead the best possible lives, actually, we think we've got some stuff that together we could work on that might help better achieve that than current services are doing, then we'd all learn a bit about how to do it and about how to make evidence work in practice. But we do it by not exactly underplaying the evidence, but not banging on about the evidence, if you like, just bringing it to the table when we're then trying to work on what does a good solution look like to achieving ordinary lives. So I don't know what the leadership equivalent of that is, but people have been really clear with us that you win over practitioners by connecting to their value bases and showing that it can work and make a difference. And if you can't show that, in one sense, maybe we should shut up or get better evidence or something. The proof is in the pudding. So the way it was framed to me by a service user actually is that Impact, John, has to not just talk about things, but it has to roll up its hands and roll up its sleeves and get its hands dirty. And that was quite a good summary for me of what we might need to do.
Thank you, John. Jennifer, could I hear from you, please?
Sorry, it's a very similar point. Actually, I was going to make. When you think of the most egregious examples of policy failure around, one is, not fixing social care in the weight of enormous evidence, both quantitative and qualitative. And the other one across the pond is the horrible state of the US healthcare system and, the need to cover the uninsured. So, mountains and mountains of evidence, mountains of really intelligent analysts and others, and yet very little progress. So the answer has, in some of the answers, got to be working with the leaders to work out that they're not evil people, most of them. They just have a different set of factors that is influencing their decision. And while analysts want to do analysis, there is the dark world of trying to influence others on their priorities using whatever it is that understanding the context, the mix of things that they are working with. So it's hard work. It's back to the point I originally said earlier, which is about communication and getting alongside people right at the very beginning. Otherwise, it's going to be a mountain to climb. Having said that, that one less gloomy note is that 20 years ago, people were pulling their hair out because no one was acting on the green agenda, despite mounting evidence as to what was happening to the planet. But a whole range of things have now happened, which now are resulting in even this government working working to try to on the green agenda. So it is possible with a variety of different approaches, but it's hard work. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. Okay, so as I sort of outlined at the start, the Midlands Decision Support Network is bringing together all these decision support units across the Midlands region, and that's about supporting ICSs to move insight from high quality analysis into action, hopefully in the form of better strategic decisions. I wonder if, just to close the session today, I could ask for each of you for a single recommendation, your one biggest recommendation, either for the ICSs trying to develop their decision support units, or for the Decision Support Network as a whole. Who shall I come to first? Maybe Nigel, go ahead.
Thanks, Simon. I think this, one of the things that we really found very beneficial, and it picks up a point that Peter made, is getting analysts to develop deep subject matter knowledge and to work alongside subject matter experts, so that they've got we always shortcut the problem, some of the issues about problem definition. It's also very much much more satisfying. There's a great presentation on the storytelling session at the end of live storytelling about where an analyst talks about how really plugging into the clinical experts who are working on her topic really brought the analysis to life. I find this with my team. It's very satisfying when you're really embedded. And actually, incidentally, for the people who are in communications, which is a key part of action of getting impact into insight into action, is how it's communicated. Having people in communications who also have a deep understanding of the issues and can have an intelligent conversation with the users, with the clinicians and decision makers, is absolutely crucial, I think.
Thank you, Nigel. Perhaps Richard, if I could come to you next.
I don't know what the state of play is in terms of relationships between your units and the strategy unit and these ICSs at the moment, but just in case it's not that intimate, I wouldn't worry too much about, are you working on the big issue? I'd just be useful really quickly. Start building up that trusted relationship with the people that you'll be working with in the longer term. If that means doing some things that look a little bit odd, well then so be it, because I think that'll help you in the longer term. And really linked to that, this is a journey. The ICSs are on a journey, provider collaboratives are on a journey, places are evolving. You'll need to move with them. And so just think about how you evolve alongside that system, because this is not a settled state we're going to be in April. It's going to be moving. It could be moving quite quickly. And to stay relevant, you need to sit alongside that.
Thank you, Richard. John, if I could come to you next.
Yes, I mean, I guess for me, data and evidence is a means to an end, not an end in itself. And so that does beg the question about what kind of outcomes we're trying to achieve and about whose outcomes they are. Really briefly, some colleagues in a book on mental health services drew attention to the issue of recovery in mental health services, with a guy who was hearing voices, and the clinical intervention was designed to stop him hearing voices. That was the outcome that was sought by the profession. And it worked. The voices stopped. In the process, the medication he was on was very powerful, and it made him impotent. And in time, it became too big an impediment to his relationship, which broke up. And he spiraled in terms of his mood. He lost his job, and then he lost his house. So we've got a situation where there's something that was clinically effective, the voices were stopped, but that by any other measure was a really rubbish outcome in terms of the quality of someone's life. Now, stepping back from that, if we were trying to analyse what works and then get it used in practice, there's a series of data sets that we have and tools and techniques that we could use to try and understand those issues at a system level. But unless we've had that prior debate about what are we trying to achieve and for whom, and whose outcome are we trying to deliver, we could be deploying our efforts and our expertise in the wrong way. So this is about a means to an end of better services and better outcomes. But that implies that we have a shared sense of what success looks like, and we can marshal our skills and our data towards that notion of what success would look like.
Thank you, John. Jennifer, your recommendation.
Thank you. Well, all of those great, but I think I'd probably just want to emphasise what Richard was saying, which is to really get alongside these ICSs, understand them, understand the leaders, develop trust, understand their world, what they're balancing, and therefore where your analysis is going to be sitting, and try to understand and help them think through, the leaders, if you like, or the implementers, that if the results showed this, then how you might then affect change early on. So get alongside them and understand their world.
Thank you, Jennifer. And finally, Peter, any additional recommendations there, given what you've heard?
I'm possibly slightly conflicted on this one, but well, just to clarify for people on the call, so the network involves each ICS having its own team, and what the network does is it connects those teams up for the purposes of learning, for collaboration, and for some sort of scale activities, including some bits of big question analysis. So, and critically, it's member owned. So no one's told the Midlands ICSs to do this. They've chosen to do it. So, and it's been going for kind of a year and a half, and we've just crossed the point now where the language is starting to shift to the network being ours, that them saying this is ours, as opposed to it being something external. So my recommendation is the NHS loves nothing more than fiddling with things. We've got this thing, it's been going for a year and a half. It may not be perfect, but it's good. And people are now starting to behave like owners. So my recommendation is, for heaven's sake, stick with it, invest in it, and build it. And then let's see what it's capable of doing.
Brilliant. Thank you, Peter. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thanks to our excellent panel. We can carry on this conversation, if you like, in the land of Twitter at our hashtag Insight2021. And do follow us at Midlands DSN if you haven't already. Also, don't forget to check out the website of the Midlands Decision Support Network for a bit more information, some of our analysis, our educational programme, as well as all of the other recordings of the other sessions that have been a part of the Insight 2021 Festival. Feel free to get in touch if you'd like to find out more about the network. I'm sure we can pop some contact details in the chat box. But that's everything for today. Thanks everyone for joining.